Hello, everybody. I'm Thomas J. Bellezza, and welcome to the Right Mindset. Today, we are having a lovely interview. I'm here with Dr. Kenneth Atchity, who is a highly accomplished individual with a diverse background in academia and the entertainment industry. He is an American producer, author, columnist, book reviewer, brand consultant, and professor of comparative literature. I'm deeply pleased to have him come on as a guest. I know Ken from the back in the days of my life. Ken, thank you so much, Dr. Atchity, for joining me on this interview.
It's my pleasure. Great to see you again. Thank you
Yeah,
for having me.
yeah. I know you're a busy gentleman, and so taking a couple minutes out of your time for a morning interview is. I hope if you need coffee or anything, you let me know. I'll bring it to you. Okay.
Okay, sounds good.
With that said, though, just for anyone who's out there who doesn't know very much, you've been in the industry in one form or another, writing, whether as a professor or a producer, as I said in the intro, since basically the '70s. So if anyone's out there, I recommend highly looking up Ken, Dr. Atchity, and looking into his companies. And today we're going to sort of get a little deeper into his insight and try to understand where he's come from, where he is, and maybe where his future's going. Because I know he also publishes books himself, and he also helps publish other people's books. So Ken, with that said, let me ask you, you've been working in this industry since the '70s, a time when you taught writing, helped writers, and moved into publishing. There's something inspiring about your dedication to giving back to others and opening paths to elevate writers who have come your way. I'd love to know more about that driving force in you and if having a mission really is something you recommend others have in this industry.
Yeah, having a mission is what makes your life, what makes you get up in the morning and, keep at it all day. And I guess I've had the same mission since I was basically a kid. When I was 7 or 8, and my mother made me sit at the breakfast room table and write stories because her mantra was, if somebody else can do it, you can do it. And she was, I suppose, a frustrated writer herself, but she was a storyteller because she was from Louisiana, where I was born, and down there in Cajun country, sitting on the front porch or on a boat somewhere led to storytelling inevitably. There's a lot of time, a lot of time available when you're waiting for a fish to bite,
Yeah.
and what you do during that time is you tell stories. And on the front porch, when people get together, the way they keep themselves from strangling each other is to tell stories. And I had these uncles who I could rank by their ability to tell stories. I had one uncle who, the minute he started telling the story, everybody sort of vacated the porch and went to get their coffee refilled because he was the worst storyteller in the world. But that didn't stop him from telling these interminable stories. But I had another uncle who everybody was riveted by, and nobody would think of leaving the porch when he started telling the story. He just knew how to tell them. Like they used to say about joke tellers. Some people can tell them, some people can't.
Yeah.
And So that's why I learned about storytelling, and it suddenly just, when I was a kid, became the most important thing in my life. Um, Somebody said once that the universe is not made of atoms; it's made of stories,
Mm.
and certainly the human universe is that way. That's in our lives. What's your story is probably the most familiar question of all, and it happens if you're going on a first date. It happens if you're in a courtroom.
Oh, yeah.
Uh, it happens if you're trying to buy a car, you're to decide on who's going to win a political contest. It all comes down to what's your story. And if somebody arrived here from a distant planet, that's what we'd want to know. What's your story? And he'd want to know the same thing. Storytelling is how we control our world. Unless we know somebody's story, we don't feel in control.
Mm.
So the first thing you do is, that's what espionage is all about, is finding out what the real story is. And so I fell in love with storytelling, and I've been involved in every side of it. I've been an editor since I was a kid, like 10 years old, I was editing the parish newspaper
Oh, nice.
onto the high school newspaper, onto my college newspaper, the Hoya at Georgetown. And I've been an editor all my life, editing people's stories, and a teacher of stories, a writer of stories, publisher of stories, a representative selling stories. I've sold hundreds of books to traditional publishers, and we've published hundreds of our own.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I suddenly have a bell in my ear, and I can't find my phone. Oh my God.
It's all right. No one judges on this channel, Ken.
Okay, well, good. Excuse me for reacting to a bell.
It's all good.
Ever since Pavlov, we've known that's a normal thing to do. Yeah, so that's my story. I've just always been in love with storytelling, and still to this day, when I sit down and start reading a manuscript, if it's a story that's really good, I just have this amazing feeling that can't be replaced by anything else.
Yeah.
I'm reading a book now that's about a familiar character in the Old Testament that we all know, but nobody's ever heard it
Yeah.
told like this, and it's just a mesmerizing story.
Yeah.
And we just published a couple of books that are wonderful stories, and the minute I see it, as my goal really has always been to get a story to its maximum audience. So I formed the Writers Lifeline Company long ago to help storytellers, their technique and talent to the level of their vision and ambition. And stories come in rough form. We help them smooth them out and make them ready for representation. And then we take them out to the markets with Story Merchant, which is our main company. And then we produce them through Atchity Productions, which is our production company. All the companies I have were created for the sake of fulfilling various needs that storytellers have.
Yeah.
Over the years, and of course have evolved as the market has evolved. The delivery systems, from streaming television, which we never would have dreamed of, 15 years ago, to to your telephone, which has storytelling ability now.
Mm-hmm. You're if I may, you're specifically talking about verticals, like they're moving into verticals. Is that what you're talking about with the phone?
Yeah, I'm talking about, there's now stories on the phone.
Yeah.
And you can click into them, and suddenly you're caught in a story, and you have to keep watching it. But everything you see, even advertising, is a story when you think about it. I mean, some of my favorite stories are 30-second ads.
Yeah.
That are unforgettable just because they capture the essence of storytelling.
Yeah.
So that's how humans communicate. I was in Italy as a Fulbright professor one year, and I ran into a professor, and he was, his wife, he had just married a Puerto Rican wife. Mm-hmm. And she, you'd think as a Latina, she would be familiar with Italian ways and fit right in. But in fact, it was just a great big clash of, cultures and sensitivities. Yeah. And he was trying to explain that to me the way I'm explaining it. And he said, "Oh, forget that. Let me just tell you a story." And then he stopped and said, "Because isn't life just a story after all?" Mm-hmm. And I never forgot that, because it made me realize that the best way to hold the attention of a class or of anybody is to start telling them a story.
Yeah. Because
then they can relate to it. If it's a story, if it's a mathematical equation, or if it's an explanation, the brain tries to work it out, but sooner or later, usually sooner, it tunes out and looks for something they can understand immediately, which is a story.
Yeah.
And so I'm a story merchant. I live in the world of stories. Somebody called me that once because they realized I was, my inheritance was that of a Phoenician. And the Phoenicians took goods from port to port throughout the ancient world.
Yeah.
But what they also took, they invented the alphabet, for example. Mm-hmm. They also took stories. And that's why we see passages in the Odyssey that resemble passages in the Ramayana. and why, the Old Testament is filled with stories you can find in, an ancient Indian uh, and biblical text as well, because stories were being swapped around as long as humans have been on this planet.
Yeah.
And that's
And,
it's,
and if I may, you didn't you do your dissertation on the Homer Iliad or something like that? You studied Greek, right, in college?
yeah. I was by the time I got to Yale, I think I had 12 years of Greek already, and so I studied the fact that a story, the dissertation was called Homer's Iliad, the Shield of Memory,
Mm.
um, because I realized that for the Greeks who didn't have a written literature yet when Homer was composed, a story was the way they remembered everything about their culture.
Yeah.
It's what held them together. It was the shield. It was the remembered shield that held them together and gave them the same values. And if something clashed with those values, then a story about that clash ended up becoming a story that everybody needed to listen to. And that's what the Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey were. So that was, that was, to me, that was fascinating. And I started out writing a simple thesis that ended up being 853 pages long, and won the Porter Prize at Yale for the best dissertation of the year.
Yeah. Wow.
And,
Congratulations.
and ended up being published. Yeah, well, that was a long time ago. And one of the things about storytellers is they care about the past, but only as a material for a story.
Yeah.
And that's why on the National Archives in Washington, it says, what is past is prologue.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you don't know the past, you need to know what the past tells us, because that's going to predict the future.
Mm.
And one of the things, to me, the most troubling thing about our world we live in today is that people's ignorance of the past is shocking. I mean, and it's troubling because the very same stuff that's going to happen to them, that happened back then, it's going to happen again if you don't know about it. The only way you can change your future is by knowing the past and avoiding the pitfalls that humans have walked into in the past.
Yeah, and you were bringing up the Homer Iliad and how they basically that was a way of telling these stories and keeping kind of morality and tradition alive is by communication, because they didn't have these books. And I I can almost link that back to when you were talking with your uncles, where they would tell their stories. And with that said, were you inspired to become more of an oral storyteller when you experienced that, or did that directly lead into literature? Where I know you're young, you were saying you're young, but I mean like the written word, or were you fascinated with the oral presentation?
I was, that's a good point. I was fascinated with the oral presentation. That's probably why I became a good professor for years. I was for 20 years a professor. Um, it's, you get up in front of a class and you try to explain something. And I remember when I was at Georgetown, I had a professor who sat on the edge of his desk and told us about World War II.
Hmm.
And to him, it was just a big story. I
Yeah.
never forgot a word he said. I really understood what was going on. And I had other professors who would stand up in front of the class, and I would walk out of the class an hour later and have no idea what they said, because they didn't do it as a story. They said, these are the forces of economic and political combination and blah, blah, blah. And they tried to do it in equations. And, geometry was the same thing. If somebody had told me that you needed to master geometry to sail a boat across the lake, because you needed to understand that the keel was on one trajectory and the sails were taking you another way, and the wind and your work at the wheel, I could have understood geometry, but I didn't. It was all taught without any reference to stories, and that was too bad, because that's how we pick up everything is through stories. And so we're mesmerized by stories. And one of the things about stories is that we don't mind hearing the same one over and over again.
Yeah.
It's like how many times I've read King Lear, I couldn't even count. And how many times I've read Don Quixote, I couldn't even count. And when you see a story and you go, oh, that's just like, as far as the comparative literature, you compare things. You say, Oh, Virgil's Aeneid is very much like the Iliad, and Dante's Inferno borrows from both the Aeneid and the Iliad, and that just enhances the story to know that this guy is retelling an ancient story. Like when Dante goes into the underworld, well, so did Odysseus go into it in the Odyssey, and so did Aeneas go into it in the Aeneid, and then you realize that he changed this and he changed that, and the change becomes the essence of the new story. And don't get me started. I could go on.
Well, yeah, I mean, when it comes down to all that stuff, uh, move the film industry alone is brings in so much money. Maybe not as much as it did maybe 10, 12 years, or definitely before COVID, but we are consumed by stories, as you're saying, from literature to film to television to even just plays or music. Music is a story in itself too, uh, and there was a really nice quote you said that I would say directly connects to that. Is that I read this recently that you said, "I've always believed stories change the world, and to me, that's the highest accolade." And this is like a deeply profounding truth about art. Is I don't, it's a nice step into your mind, into the insight of how beneficial or rewarding art has been to you. And this is basically the artist in you breathing a strong point of it all, and how and why we create art. And those stories that you're talking about, that you keep bringing up, that I love, is that they are the soul of humanity expressed over generations and left to the future to explore. So, how does the essence of this quote lure you to choose the right stories to not only put your time into and invest into for business reasons, but also for your own personal pleasure?
Well, I mean, obviously, I need to I need to love a story before I can get behind it. So there are some stories that are well told, but I don't love them.
Mm,
So that's but the truth is, I'm extremely eclectic. I love, romantic comedies. I love historical stories. I love, you know, there isn't a genre that I don't have some affection for. So when somebody tells a story from any genre, like historical fiction that I'm now reading as a new manuscript that I referred to before, when I read that, something gets excited about me because I'm saying this guy is telling a great story in a kind of epic way, and it's a story that we know, but we know it, very differently. But he's brought it alive again. He's
mm,
got it narrated by two angels, and angels live in a timeless world, and they're using 20th century, 21st century language to tell the story because time means nothing to them. So what you would call an anachronism in the old days, you can't call in this story because these angels have a perspective that's timeless.
yeah.
And just the fact that the narrator, the author chose to do that made me excited about it. It's another refinement on storytelling. And so, yeah, that's uh, what I love is to see what people can do. It's turning, as I said in one of my books somewhere, it's turning old familiar new.
Mm,
And that's what people love. They love to see the same things happening in a new way. I mean, you watch a new James Bond movie or a new Tom Cruise movie just to see how they're going to make this different, but it's always the same story.
yeah.
The hero runs into trouble, a bunch of stuff happens, and then he emerges triumphant against all odds.
Hmm.
That's the outline of all these stories, but we watch them because we like that ending. That's a comic ending in
Yeah.
strict terms. Tragedy and comedy defined by Aristotle was that tragedy is when things end horribly for the hero, and comedy is when things end well for the hero. It doesn't
Mm,
mean laughing; it means the ending is a comic.
yeah.
Like in Greek drama, comedies ended with marriages usually, and in today's world, we have a whole different view of marriage. So we see renditions of that end up delivering the same happy feeling.
Yeah.
Uh, and the thing about fiction that people really love is that we're in the middle of a complete messy life. We used to be maybe that people had more orderly lives, although I doubt that. But
Yeah.
today, there's no claim to that possible. Life is a complete mess. And just when you think things are going well, something happens and everything is not going well again.
Yeah.
So you go to the theater as Lincoln did one night to see something satisfying, because a story satisfies you. It gives you an ending that you can relate to and control, whereas life does not satisfy you that way. And when you get old enough, you end up learning that you've got to tell your own story in life
Yeah.
and be satisfied with it, because life is not going to do that for you. Life doesn't care about loose ends. It's
Mhm.
always loose ends. And stories defy loose ends and give you order instead. So it's our man's search for order ends up being telling stories.
Yeah, and there was you're talking about you mentioned how, like, some people have to take it into their own hands and write the stories, tell their stories, and be be proactive or have agency to connect it back to writing in general. And if I may, like, authors, they have this kind of fantasy, this if only dream of making a living writing books, and therefore they live like lost in this hope but without action. And you wrote a book called Quit Your Day Job and Live Out Your Dreams. And this book is something where you've actually taken the action. You jumped from one profession into a new life with the worry of not getting a regular paycheck, as you've said in interviews. And this fear itself keeps people still. But there was something about you. So you had this brain change, this switch of the mind that helped you open the doors to see that there were, quote unquote, no wolves or fear. What was that brain change, that switch of the mind that helped you make that leap?
Well, that is a great question. And when I think of it that way, when we think of it that way, it really had to go back to feelings. And the one feeling that gave me the greatest nightmare since I was a kid, I used to dream I was suddenly, as I was sleeping, I was smothered by this enormous quilt,
Mm,
uh, probably caused by my aunt in Louisiana, who I spent the summers with. And she had huge quilts on the feather
yeah,
quilts on the feather beds. And in the summertime, that was cozy, but it was also suffocating,
mm,
suffocating. So probably my greatest fear was suffocation. And I started to have that fear after 15 years or so of being a professor. I started feeling suffocated because I realized that I wasn't running free the
uh,
way a kid dreams of doing, getting out of that quilt and just running along the bayou, or, just
yeah,
running. And as the older I got, the more I realized that freedom was an illusion,
mm,
because there's a lot of philosophical arguments that we're not really free, no matter what we think, that we're limited by a bunch of factors. Um, but so was suffocation, so was security, which is, the one thing, if you're in under a heavy quilt, you're secure.
yeah,
And that, to a lot of people, including my father, security was the highest of all possible values.
mm,
Um, and that's because he was post-war. He had 5 children. He had to struggle to keep them fed and educated and all of that, which was
mhm,
amazing. But security just seemed an illusion to me from the beginning. And freedom was my illusory ideal. And that's why I left one world for another, because I wanted a world in which I was free. And I left a world of complete security where I was a tenured professor and could count on getting the same paycheck every 2 weeks until I
yeah,
retired. And then after retirement, continue getting a paycheck every 2 weeks for the rest of my life. My father was thrilled with that. When I
yeah,
called him and told him I was quitting and becoming a producer, he goes, "Well, how are you going to make a living?" I go, I have no idea. I really have no idea." But then a few weeks later, uh, I invited him up to Montreal, where I was shooting a movie, and got him as an extra to play a tiny role in front of the Montreal Stock Exchange. He was an accountant,
oh, that's great.
and the irony was not lost on him. Um, and we were sitting one night in my apartment during a blizzard, the night before he was going to shoot his scene. And
Yeah.
he said, where's the script? I need to read the script. And I said, Dad, you trust me, you don't need to read the script. You're not going to say anything. You're just going to stand there and offer a bagel to the leading lady when she comes out of the building.
Yeah.
He goes, just don't feel right without reading the script. So I had to have a messenger sent from the office through the blizzard to the apartment. And he sat there reading it while I was on the phone. And then when I hung up from a long call, he said, geez, I don't have any lines. I said, Dad, we're in Canada. We're Americans. You can't have lines. It's very complicated to give you lines. Then you become an official extra and blah, blah, blah. Well, 2 weeks later, after he'd gone home to Kansas City, the director called me and said, I'm cutting your father's scene today. Do you want to come into the studio and watch us edit it?
Yeah.
I go, yeah, sure. So I drove down to the studio, watched it, and suddenly my father is saying, would you like a bagel? And the lady is saying, yes, that's why I'm here. And he said, would onion or you want onion or garlic? And I go, oh my God. I said to the director, how did my father get lines here? He said, well, I knew he was your father, and I just thought it wasn't right if he didn't have lines. And a week after he was back in Kansas City, my father called me and said, never stop being a producer. This is the right thing to do. And, despite the thick and thin of that, on the thinnest of times, he kept telling me, stay with it. And I, when I told him I was leaving my tenured position to become a producer, he said, how are you going to make a living? Which is the same thing that he said when I decided not to major in pre-med at college, but to major in literature. He said, how are you going to make a living? And so it was a clash of values, the desire for freedom versus the desire for security. And only because of his successful life did I feel security wasn't a big issue with me. Like, he would say things like, save for a rainy day. And I started taking that apart in my mind and thinking, well, if it's a rainy day, what does that mean? What's the metaphor there? And you have insurance for medical things. You have other protections. I just couldn't imagine a rainy day that depended on me having saved, a lot of money. But, I wasn't the father of 5 kids either.
Yeah.
Just he was. So, it's deep down when you make big decisions, it's usually because something inside you isn't happy and you're trying to make it happy. You're trying to adjust your life. And what saddens me is when people are not happy. I see people all the time, of course, who are stuck in their job, And I remember once I was teaching a course on how to stay inspired in Hollywood, right? And I was at UCLA and I had 20 actresses in one class. And I said, okay, well, let's start by going around the room. Tell me your name and tell me where you're from.
Yeah.
And tell me what is the worst question you get in LA and how do you deal with it?
Yeah.
So one of the women said, I'm Sarah, I'm from Detroit. And the worst question that I get in LA is, when are you going to move to Detroit and
get a job?
When are you going to move back to Detroit and work at the post office?
Yeah.
And I said, and how do you deal with that? She goes, usually I burst into tears and leave the room.
Yeah.
And I go, well, we're going to work on that in this class. And then suddenly the next one said her name was Mary and she was from Ohio. And the worst question she heard regularly was, what have you been in big that I've seen? And I said, oh my God, that's terrible. And what do you answer? And she goes, I always say the Pacific Ocean. And everybody burst into tears and laughter. And I said, and how do you deal with that? She goes, that's, we end up being friends. Because, she had built herself a shield from the stupid things that people say. They don't mean bad. They just say what comes into their head, right? And but it's a devastating question to somebody who's trying to make it in the film industry.
Yeah.
Like cutting it all down to like, what have you been in big that I've seen? Just it's a totally callous response to the sensitivities of an artist, right?
Yep.
But one was a warrior who had thought it out and had figured out her defense on the battlefield in advance, and one person had not yet figured that out. She just burst into tears and left the arena, you know?
Yeah.
And so it's tricky to be in this complete free environment because it is the biggest attack you can imagine on your stability and your powers as a human. Everything happens to you to make you, you know, feel like nothing. We're doing a movie right now. I just wrote a book called Mr. Irrelevant, and no business makes you feel more irrelevant than the film business. You know, I don't care how big you are and what incredible movie you just made, but people like my brother would always say, "What was the box office?" You know, and
Like,
you know, and even if the movie goes down in history as a great movie, you know, there's the other part of the world that just wants to know the box office, and then his other question would be, "How much did you make?" You know, and you know, it's a different world, and I wanted that test. I wanted that, you know, pushing the envelope experience and seeing if I could handle it. And yeah, there are a lot of times when I think you are the stupidest guy in the world because you should never have done this. But then times when I look back on my career and think, I can't believe I did all this stuff. Like movies made and have several in production now. And but you know, it's a question of how far do you want to go and how much do you value stability versus instability.
Well, yeah,
and,
you know,
I've always.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ken.
No, that's it. I was taking a coffee break.
So, you know, you're saying a lot of really interesting things, and the first thing I want to definitely reference is, you know, Shawshank Redemption was neither a box office hit or something people talked about until it came out on VHS, right? And like that movie changed people's lives, you know, like you know, and that goes right back to your storytelling, you know, like stories that really connect to something deeper. But I want to talk about the universal experience that you're basically representing, and like I dealt with a literary agent once that came to me. By the way, I didn't come to them; they came to me. They were like noticing I was doing stuff. And then I didn't want to work with them, though. You know, I just was not in the place to work with them. And they say, well, you're not even a real writer because you haven't written a Marvel film yet. And I was like, yeah, but I make a living off of developmental editing and cleaning scripts up. And I write for people. I don't do my own stuff right at the time. But for her to say something like that was interesting because it directly reflects what you're saying is, you know, sometimes the industry can be cruel and dismissive, and you know, how do we respond to that? And I always talk about responding with kindness, you know, because you got to be kind to everyone. You never know who someone is or who someone knows. And but even those girls, you know, what were you in lately? You know, like your quality is not based on what you're necessarily doing. It's how you're doing it and what is your impact in that world. And even if you're not on screen, you might be impacting behind the scenes, and that's just as valuable. But I do want to get to another question for you. Before I say something, you said something really funny about your father saying, well, how are you going to make money? And we are not the same age. I would say you're slightly older than I am, for anyone who, you know, from the set. Yeah. And my parents literally would say the same thing, where they're just like, "What? I didn't want to get a job. I got into the music industry. How are you going to make money?" Then they see me playing in front of 4,000 or 5,000 people at a stadium, and they're like, "Oh, all right, never mind." Then I switched careers, and you know, I'm owning a theater, you know, a playhouse theater, you know, and they're like, "How are you going to make money?" And I'm like, "I own this." like it brings money in. They're like, yeah, but who pays you a paycheck? And it's true. Like there is a generation that grew up, I have to work. And like, it's hard to believe that if I put my time and effort into something I'm passionate about, something I believe in, that a creative endeavor would actually return, you know, capital to me, that I can make a living doing it. And, you know, it's really nice that your father got on board and to see that. And not a lot of people get that sort of change in their parents. They always have this, like, I'm waiting for them to get their Oscar moment, you know, and like, until that happens, you've done nothing, even though you consistently work and pay your bills in that field. What do you, you know, it's like, What do you say to people you are mentoring that are having that doubt that you said you sometimes had, and then you realize you're in that world where their parents just are not supporting them? What is some advice that you give them?
Well, that's what the book you referenced, how to escape lifetime security and pursue your impossible dream. That's what that's all about. Is the advice I gleaned from what I did myself. First of all, you have to keep going
Yeah.
and say, look, this is what I'm going to do. And at first, people sometimes they fear you, and they certainly fear for you. But sooner or later, they start praising you and admiring you, and that was really weird. That was more uncomfortable than when they feared for me, because I thought, I'm not a hero. I mean, I like to think of. That's nice that they think of me that way, and
Yeah.
I like to think what I'm doing is heroic. But believe me, when you're doing it, as you don't feel like a hero. You feel like an imposter, in fact.
Yeah.
And there's a whole thing called the imposter syndrome. Um, when you're doing something new, you go, "What the hell am I doing here? I don't know how to do this." But then, I remember once when we were doing our first film, I had my assistant from LA with me, and we were on the side of a field, and they were measuring a field with tape measures, so because a horse was supposed to gallop across in the first scene, and they needed to know exactly how long it was going to take the horse to go there. And she says, "What the hell are we doing here?" And I said, "You know what? We have no idea, but don't tell anybody that. Just pretend that you know what you're doing, because sooner or later you will know what you're doing." And
Yeah.
it's true. Like 5 films later, she knew what she was doing, and I knew what I was doing. At least I thought, I was pretending to. And so that's that feeling of being an imposter, like a stranger in a new land, a stranger in a strange land. That's a good feeling to me. That's where your brain gets excited, and where you find out what your limits are. That's why people like to be astronauts. I mean, they want to go to a strange place and see if they can handle it. And so, but other people are more comfortable if they just have a 9 to 5 job and get a check every week, and then go to the barbecue on Saturday. And that's okay. But, I notice over the years that those people have a strange kind of envy for the other people. They wouldn't do it themselves. It makes them scared. I remember went out with a woman years ago when I was just beginning in the film business, and I was telling her some of my concerns because had no idea where next week's money was coming from. She goes, I could never live with you. I couldn't deal with this. It scares me to death.
Yeah.
And I got it. I understood. But being scared to death, there's an old Cajun saying, if you ain't scared, you ain't doing anything interesting. And so I always lived my life that way. When I started feeling great concern, that's when the most exciting things happen.
Yeah.
It's like being on the battlefront and not knowing how you're going to deal with the next attack, but you're going to deal with it. I mean, one of the cool things that happens when you do it for years is after a certain point, you realize, I can do this because I've done it. I've done it over and over again. I've faced weekends where I had no idea how I would get, started on Monday, until I worked something out over the weekend. I call them dark nights of the soul. And every writer we deal with, I have a coaching thing that's just about your career. Everybody's going through that all the time.
Yeah.
But that's what makes them grow. And in the best writers, that's what makes their writing good, is that they're feeling that and putting it down, as a story to tell others. And to me, that's just sheer ecstasy. That's what life's all about at its best. And I would just hate to be, as T.S. Eliot said, measuring my life out in teaspoonfuls. He oddly enough, he was a teller at a bank most of his life.
Yeah.
As his poetry became more and more famous, he was still working as a teller. He never got money from it. He just, from the poetry.
Well, at least he had a job. His parents were happy. No.
Yeah, exactly. They didn't mind his writing, award-winning poetry as long as he had a paycheck.
I had the job. Yeah. And it's you're saying something interesting about the you know, you have to take a chance, and it's not easy to take that chance, and I think that is a fear that authors and because here's something that I talk about, especially in one of the books that I published, where I talk about it's how to be successful, right? And it's like I have to become so good before I start. Like that kind of mentality that stops people, it slows people. Like I have to be the best writer, the best actor, or the best this before I even try. And you're talking about failing to succeed, that it took you 5 films to start getting your grip. And correct me if I'm wrong, but some of the best directors and producers out there are ones that are finding solutions, by the way, that they discovered by failing multiple times in the past. So I
love to quote Winston Churchill, who said that success is moving from one failure to another without losing your enthusiasm.
Yes. Yeah. And you need that. You need that more than anything. And I think like I tell actors, writers, everybody, like when you're getting into your community, nothing, no matter how much because until you're in the field, until you're physically around that world, you're not getting a real education. You're just learning stuff you don't understand. And when I got into the music industry, my record label, the idea of if I get signed, then they'll pay for everything and I can focus on music. That's the same thing with writers. If I get published or if I get an agent, then I can focus on writing and they can handle the stuff. And you realize, oh, wait, I still have to market. I still have to build relationships. I still have to develop my career. And they don't learn that until they jump into it. But I do want to, there's something about your career that I want to bring up. But I'm gonna sort of shift there with this mentality where, like, once a writer sort of finds their footing and they're quote unquote in that career and they're making some money, I've always found it interesting that the creative mind it sort of lacks the courage for diversity to change things up, sort of like you did, where you changed your careers from here to there. And to me, it's like writers write, actors act, musicians, musician. But what I love about your career, and I think people could be inspired by this, is you were a professor and you took the leap and you became an author, a publisher, an agent, a producer, and all these things. You've embodied, I would say, the power of success by not placing all your eggs in one basket. It's these shifts that continue to keep you moving, present, one might say, in the creative community. And I think that makes you a true asset, a true value to the tables you join. And I don't think you're dealing with ADHD. You're dealing with a sort of evolution of your career. So with that said, what is it about those shifts that steered you to make those changes? Basically, how did you know where you were making the right shift from one area to another?
Well, that's another great question. I remember when I was a professor, a colleague of mine and I started a magazine, a journal, actually, called DreamWorks. It was called DreamWorks long before there was the real DreamWorks. And it was about the relationship between dreams and the arts. And we outlined, we wrote a letter to 135 accomplished writers and artists and inventors in all the realms of thought, asking them to send us a dream that meant something to them, and how they turned it into something else, something like a poem, a song, whatever. And to our astonishment, we got 120 responses. And these were top people. I mean, our advisory board was Ursula Le Guin, John Foles, William Burroughs. I mean, we really had great people. And so then we put it all on paper and sent it out for financing to various companies. And one of them was Psychology Today. And Paul Chance, I think, was the editor-in-chief. And we sent it to him. And he wrote back a letter saying it was really wonderful stuff, but here's my advice to you. He said, find your niche, young man, find your niche. And that was to me the most stupid thing I've ever heard in my life. He was saying what you were saying, like, do what you do well and keep doing it.
Yeah.
And that was completely adverse to my way of thinking. I like combining things, like he thought it was preposterous to combine dreams and, and creativity.
Yeah.
So I think what motivates you is to seeing the world the way you see it, and wondering why everybody else doesn't see it that way. In fact, Gertrude Stein, in her brilliant little book called Picasso, the only book of hers that I really dug in every way, she said, she was talking about Picasso, and she said, the thing about Pablo was he was seeing what he was seeing while everyone else was seeing something else. But after a while, as we were seeing what he was seeing, we started seeing it the same way. And of course, by that time, he was seeing something else.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, that's what creativity is all about. It's seeing the way you see it and pursuing that seeing, trying to express it so that other people could see it. And of course, you yourself are no longer interested in that particular one. You're off into something else. I mean, that's why to an artist, the most boring thing he can imagine is his last painting.
Yeah.
He's already dreaming of something else and going on with it.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just seeing how far your brain can go. Like I was raised by, and taught by Jesuits, and to them, their ultimate thing was to test yourself, was to continue seeing how far you could go, to, how much you could discover, not only in the world, but in your own brain, about its potential. And that's why it's so deadening to see people in humdrum jobs. I mean, I'll never forget, my father made me work every summer to, teach me responsibility. And one summer I was literally counting nuts and bolts in an auto factory. And that was my job, was to sit on the floor and take one case of nuts after another and count the nuts. Damn. 8 hours a day,
Wow.
And,
did that drive you nuts?
Yeah, it drove me nuts. Exactly. I mean, what I was doing in my brain was something entirely different than counting nuts. And but it was showing me the two ways of working. I mean, my brother, who was an entrepreneur, a serial entrepreneur, once said that he only invested in dirty businesses, aircraft parts, things like that, sludge oil. He only liked things that nobody else wanted anything to do with. Of course, he was very envious of me, meeting stars and, making movies. But he could never have done it in a million years because there's zero certainty in it, complete uncertainty. I mean, movies are canceled midway through shooting them because some political event happens in a faraway country and suddenly that movie is not going to ever get released and blah, blah, blah. He couldn't handle that kind of uncertainty.
Yeah.
And my father thought he couldn't either. He couldn't either. My mother was always saying, go for it. Go for it. If other people can do it, why can't you do it?
Yeah, exactly.
So it was, to me, it was like wanting to use myself up to the utmost, and not just do something controlled and quiet. And, there have been many times in my life where I think, what a moron you were for not just sticking to it, getting that paycheck every 2 weeks for the rest of your life. One of my favorite people was a writer, a prolific novelist named John Gardner, who wrote Nickel Mountain, The Sunlight Dialogues, Grendel, and he edited my first books and taught me how to write, basically, and told me when he heard that I was leaving my tenured position, he goes, "Actually, you're nuts. Why don't you just stay there? You can do all this other stuff while you're still a professor." But to me, that was deeply dishonest. I thought, yeah, I could, but I want to go for it. My mother was always saying, I want to really go for it, take the risk, blah, blah, blah.
Immerse yourself basically into that world.
Yeah. Well, and commit yourself to it. In other words, don't hedge your bets by keeping one foot in, on secure turf and the other not. Just go for it. Well, that was probably a crazy decision. And of course, crazy is a word that we think a lot about if you're in the artistic world. I mean, who was it who said Salvador Dali said the only difference between me and a madman is that I am not mad. And I never forgot that, because I thought, Shakespeare said there's method in his madness, and that's I'm very methodical, but I'm not quite mad because I'm aware of what I'm doing. And anyway, obviously, this is a subject I love to talk about.
Yeah. I'm not stopping. I love hearing it. Yeah, I love hearing your stories. But we're getting close to the hour, and with all guests, I always ask the same last question. If I may throw it up on the screen, I'm going to read it out loud, but just so you can see it. Dr. Atchity, what is one piece of advice you discovered about writing that completely changed the way you approach the writing process?
That's another very good question,
Thank you.
and I can answer it. I think the most important advice I can give a writer is never sit down to write until you know exactly what you're going to write before you sit down.
Yeah.
Don't face a blank screen. Don't try to write at the computer. Let a story build itself in your brain, and one day, when it's ready, it'll come out, and that's when you sit down, because then there's no such thing as writer's block. You become, so William Saroyan wrote The American Tragedy, and somebody asked him if it was true. He wrote it in a drugstore in 3 days. He goes, "Oh no, not at all." He goes, I typed it out in 3 days.
Yeah.
In a drugstore, because he all had it in his head.
Mm-hmm.
He had the courage and wisdom to not write it before it was ready to be written.
Yeah.
Let it grow in your head. Trust your brain. Don't trust those spiral notebooks and pieces of paper and 3x5 cards. Trust your brain.
Mm-hmm.
And reject anything that isn't ready to write.
Yeah.
And you'll know when it's ready to write, because you won't be able to stand not writing it. And you learn that over the years. I mean, I didn't know this at the beginning, but you learned it over the years. I mean, by the time I got to graduate school, I figured it out, and that's why I wrote this 853-page thesis in a couple of weeks, basically.
Because it was done in your head anyway. It was something you had been thinking about.
I've been thinking about it for several years.
Yeah.
And I suddenly came to me, it's ready to write. And that's the hardest part for a new artist, is trusting himself to not do things prematurely.
Mm-hmm.
And I've obviously, over the years, I've talked to hundreds of artists, and I see the difference between, there's several groups. One is a group that doesn't know what it's doing. They have they suffer from writer's block and anxiety and post-traumatic stress. So, and the other one is the ones who figured out the creative process and do know what they're doing, and they don't have to have inspiration. They just write every day.
Mm-hmm.
One of my clients wrote 10 hours a day, every day of her life, even though she was flat on her back. She had her computer built so it could be positioned above her, and she could reach up to, type. But she was a great storyteller, and she knew what she was doing. She understood her process. People like Hemingway, Virginia Woolf, Sylvia Plath, they never understood the process and ended up, killing themselves because the process was being painful for them.
Yeah.
But they never bothered to sit down and figure it out. And in my first book on writing, A Writer's Time, I talk about the creative process and the exact steps of it. And if you look at those steps and follow them, you won't have worries. You won't have writer's block anymore. You won't have worries that you can't do it. The biggest step of all is turning your back on the writing and walking away from it. And you'll never finish anything great
Yeah.
unless you do that. You can't just stay there engaged all the time.
Yeah. And just for anyone who's listening, I will have the link to his books on Amazon and his website directly in the description below. But Ken, that's really great advice. And I teach a long form creative writing class. And one of the things I was saying is basically what you're saying is like know the story, right? So it's like writing is easy. Sarah met Chris, but being a writer is why. Why did they meet? How did they meet? Where did they meet? And you can't write that until you know it. So you have to sit there and play with the story in your head, ask questions, develop it, think about it. And then once you have it, you're no longer going to write Sarah met Chris. You're going to write the experience, her,
Yeah,
and
exactly right. I mean, Faulkner was asked once in an interview, how did he write The Sound and the Fury?
yeah.
And he said, well, to begin with, I refused to write it. I just let these scenes build in my mind. And he said, scene of a girl and her, 9-year-old girl crawling up a fig tree with her knees not bruised, but muddy, and her underpants dirty.
Yeah.
And looking in a window at the house where she'd been kept out of at a funeral going on in the house. And he said, by the time I figured out that, her knees were not bruised because she was used to climbing the tree, and her underpants were muddy because her brother had thrown her in the creek, and she was running away from him. And the funeral was the funeral of her grandfather, and she wasn't allowed in the funeral. And the book built itself in my head, and then I sat down and wrote it. So that's what you're saying. You trust yourself to have these things going on and let them develop on their own until you're ready to write them.
Yeah, because a writer. Look, I know there's pantsers out there, but at the same time, like, if we don't understand, the motivations or the positions of our characters and how they got to those situations, because even the Faulkner thing, other than writing a story with every comma he could find, and I'm a fan of, but like you're saying, it's not interesting that it's a girl in her underwear staring in a window. It was what he developed. She was running from her brother. Like all those things become interesting. And a lot of writing clients that I have, I always tell them, I go, no one cares that it's a strong female character who is the CEO of a corporation, and she also happens to be Jewish. And, like, where does she go? Like, why is she there? How did she get there? Where is she going from there? That's the part that keeps people reading, not she's on the top floor. If you start with like a thing, if for example, Faulkner started with, it's a girl, underwear, window. Why are we interested? But as soon as you even started talking about how he developed a story, I remembered how good that book was.
Right. Well, in one of my books, I tell people just the worst thing that somebody can say about your writing is, so what? You know what I mean? Like, you should ask yourself that question after every page you write, after every paragraph, after every chapter. So what? Yeah. And I just started reading a treatment yesterday that somebody had sent me. And, by page 3, I was tired of reading it because I was saying, so what? I don't get it. Why am I reading this? Why is this interesting?
Yeah.
Just giving me facts doesn't interest me, like you just said. It's I want drama. Yeah. I want conflict. And, the minute I hear that her brother pushed her in the creek, that opens up all kinds of questions in my mind about their relationship. And, we learned that the brother was mentally handicapped, and that ends up being the first chapter of The Sound of the Fury. And, you're right. It's like it's the complication that we care about, not the facts. Yeah. And no matter what the picture is, there, it's not enough. Picture means conflict, drama, and that means action. And you've got to be very heavy, very hard on yourself about putting that drama into everything you write.
Yeah. Some of the strongest writing advice I ever got was, if you need enough context to conflict it, challenge it, and reframe it, which becomes the interest, the engagement. And then you need to resolve that with narrative forward. If you just keep playing with that loop, you're going to develop an engaging story because we understand what's happening with context. We are interested in will they, won't they, challenging and reframing. And then you're like, oh, all right, good. The tension dropped. I can catch up to what's happening. And then you do it again. You set up the next scenario and so forth and so forth. And I think a lot of writers miss that when they're approaching their manuscripts, where they just focus mostly on context, where they're over explaining things.
Yeah, I mean, no explaining. That's you know, don't tell us that the old lady was upset. Bring her out on the stage and have her cry and scream.
Mm-hmm.
And that's showing, not telling. And that's the hardest thing to learn when you're not yet a storyteller. That's why my jokes were so good, because, I'll never forget one about hunting the bear. An old man is the worst bragger in the country. Nobody could brag bigger than he. And one day, all the young men were going out on a bear hunt, and he said, "Y'all have all these guns and pistols and rifles and, traps. When I was your age, we went out there with our bare hands hunting bears." And so they said, "Really? So you're going to go with us this time, and you're not going to take any weapons?" And he said, "Oh my God," he said to himself, "I'm really screwed here." And but I'll make a long story short. At the end of the day, he goes out on his own early in the morning, hoping not to be noticed. And a bear runs into him and starts chasing him. And he heads right back for the tent. And the bear is almost about to get him when he gets to the front of the tent. And the bear trips on a stump and rolls into the tent. And the old man says, "Y'all skin this one. I'm going back for another one."
That's a good twist. That's funny. That's really funny.
But it doesn't tell. You can make a joke. 5 minutes long, 2 minutes long.
Yeah.
And commercials do it in 30 seconds, 60 seconds, 90 seconds. And that's why if it's not a good commercial, you're bored out of your mind and want to flip channels. It's like stories need to grip you immediately by the throat. Keep it going.
Yeah, marketing 101, story first, product second. That's really, the other thing I wanted to say was, sometimes I see writers, they'll go, I want to show that my character's really nice. So then they'll like create a chapter that is dedicated to showing how nice their character is. And I try to explain to writers, I go, look, if a character is nice, they are nice. Like every chapter, that is their status quo, and if you're creating chapters, you're creating fluff just for, hey, I need to show that they're strong. So I'm going to show them doing something strong in this one chapter just so I can explain to people. But the thing is, if they're always nice in act one, you then get to push them to their limits to how far can they be pushed before they're not nice. And then now you're creating something compelling. But if you just create one chapter to be like, they are nice. Look how nice they were to their grandparents or something like that. Like, what is that doing for the narrative? Do you find that a commonality in some more novice, or beginner writers?
Yeah, they think they have to compartmentalize and do one thing at a time, but you don't do one thing at a time. Yeah. Like in the joke, an old man was the worst bragger in the county, right? That's the whole setup for him. That's enough. Nothing more needs to be said about his character and to show what kind of guy he is. So immediately goes to action. These young guys are going on a hunting trip, and he pokes fun at them and their weapons, and then they challenge him. So it's all conflict. And we get to know them without even realizing we get to know them, and he gets his comeuppance. When the bear starts, chasing him, and he's got no conflict, but he's running for his life. But at the end, he's still in command, because as the bear, he takes advantage of the accident. Like you don't do one thing at a time. So writing nonfiction where you spell everything out, and then you spell it out again, and then you spell it out. You say what you said after you said it. That's complete opposite of fiction. Fiction instantly puts you into a situation, and and you've got to understand the situation. So, but the minute you start explaining the situation, guess what? You lose your audience.
Yeah.
They didn't tune in for explanation. They tuned in to see action and conflict.
Yeah, like it's nice to have atmosphere and description, and like I need to know a little bit about it, maybe some backstory. But if it's presented, like I had a writer friend, asked me to look over their book, and there was literally 3 pages of them describing this castle.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what's going on here? And they're like, oh, I want people to know what the castle looks like. I'm like, yeah, but why does the character who grew up in this castle want to know what the castle looks like? They know what it looks like. So what is the emotional truth of this? What is, what's propelling them to reclaim the ground again, And they're like, well, I don't know. And then they're like, maybe they like to know their surroundings. And I go, well, if that's the case, every location they go to, you need to write a chapter. You need to show them studying their surroundings. Otherwise, not doing anything, We're just
forget it. One of my favorite short stories is supposedly the shortest short story in American literature by Richard Brautigan, and it's called The Scarlatti Tilt, and it goes like this. Have you ever lived in a one-room apartment with a man who's learning to play the viola? That's what she asked the police as she handed them the empty revolver.
Oh, that's good.
But everything is there, two sentences long, but it's got beginning, middle, end, and and suspense and surprise.
Yeah.
So there's a guy who knows how to catch your attention and hold it, and then give you a payoff at the end.
Yeah.
And it's hard for people to get it if they don't have it naturally. And I think that I kind of got it because of my joke telling background. I mean, my family lived to tell jokes.
Yeah.
Everybody was like, the minute you heard a new joke, you couldn't wait for the next family gathering, or you even phoned up somebody to tell it to them. And, we live for that. And stories united us, these little stories made us feel good and kept us together on track. And it's never been any other way with the human race. We can't wait to hear the latest story.
Yeah, because it connects us in different ways. But more importantly, one day, Dr. Atchity, you're going to have to tell me your version of the Aristocrats. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, that's a deal. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. And
absolutely.
I look forward to talking to you again.
Yeah. Before you go, though, how do people find you? Where's your website for them to hear on the audio?
Probably the best one is to go to LinkedIn and look at Writer's Lifeline, the Writer's Lifeline, and or storymerchant.com.
Excellent. And thank you so much, Dr. Kenneth Atchity. And I appreciate your insight and your wisdom and for coming on as a guest.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Great to see you again. And I'm glad we caught up.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll do this again. I promise.
Okay. That sounds good. Take care.
You take care. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.